So in this mini lesson 1.1c, we're going to talk a little bit more about domain and range. In our lesson 1.1, we wrote domain and range, talked about how to evaluate it on a graph, but I wanted to take a little time to go further and really talk about what is domain, what is range, how do I figure them out. The domain we know is all of the x values. You're only considering the width of the graph. How far left does it go? How far right does it go? Kind of think about, will it ever not cross something? Will, as it goes on forever, are there values that aren't going to be hit? So I can see on this line, it's going to keep going to the right forever and ever. It's going to keep going to the left forever and ever. My domain for this would be all of the real numbers from negative infinity to positive infinity. Remember we talked about in notation that we always use parentheses with infinity. So your domain here is simply all the way left forever and ever and ever towards negative infinity, all the way right forever and ever and ever towards positive infinity. The range, on the other hand, is the height of the graph. How far up, how far down does it go? Are there any y values that it won't eventually cross? So that doesn't mean, don't get hung up on the y-axis, just any height or depth that the graph will not cross. This, you can see, is going to keep going up and up and up forever. It's also going to keep going down and down and down forever. So there are no values vertically that this line will not cross. Therefore, our range, much like the domain, is negative infinity to positive infinity. And I'm going to use parentheses for that, again, because we can never actually reach the point of infinity. When we are writing domain and range, we're going to focus on using interval notation and make sure that you know when to use parentheses and brackets. So remember that we talked about an open circle means parentheses, a closed circle means brackets. So looking at this one, I'm going to start with my leftmost value for domain, which is at -2. So I'm going to write -2. I'm going to use a bracket because I have a closed circle. Then I'm going to go all the way to the right. Where does the graph stop on the right? It stops at 5, but this time with an open circle. So I want to use a parenthesis. And it's okay to mix and match like that. You may have 2 brackets, one of each, 2 parentheses. That's okay. Now looking at my range, I'm going to look at the bottommost value, which is at this black point again at -3. -3, and it exists there, so I'm going to use a bracket. All the way up to 1, where it does not exist, so I'm going to use a parenthesis. Okay? So you're going left to right for domain, bottom to top for range, and then determine closed point, or if the graph exists, it's a bracket, open circle, or the graph does not exist there, it's a parenthesis. Straight domain and range for this one. So starting with domain, think about how wide is this graph going to get. These arrows show us that this is going on forever in both directions. This parabola is going to keep getting wider and wider and wider and wider as it goes out. Never will it stop. So our domain here is negative infinity to positive infinity. Most of the time, when you're dealing with functions, they'll have arrows and the domain will be negative infinity, positive infinity. Not every single time, but most of the time. The range is a little different. I know this graph is going to keep going up forever. So I know that I'm going to go up to positive infinity. But am I going down to negative infinity? No. The graph bottoms out here at -6. So -6 is the lowest point on the graph. And because it exists there, I'm going to use a bracket. So in this case, my range is everything from -6 up. So -6 up to positive infinity is going to be my range. I hope that makes sense to you. I hope you can kind of see from the graph where it's going, so that you kind of understand the difference between domain and range. Domain is always the width of the graph. How wide is it getting? Range is always the height of the graph. So how high or how low is that graph getting? Here's another one. This one is finite. It's got some definite endpoints there. So we're going to write the domain and the range. So I'm going to start at my left. I see that the graph starts at -3, but it doesn't exist there. So I'm going to use a parenthesis. And then I can see that it goes to the right till it gets to 1, where the graph does exist. So I'm going to use a bracket. Domain is generally pretty easy. It's easy to see left to right. Range can be a little more difficult because this time we're going bottom to top. So how low does this graph go? It goes all the way down here to -4. -4 is the bottommost point and the graph exists there. The highest point is 0, okay? But do I use a parenthesis or do I use a bracket? I might want to say parenthesis because the graph has an open circle here. However, if I follow it around, I can see here where there's a closed circle. So the graph does exist at 0, so I'm actually going to use a bracket. That one was a little confusing with the range, and that's okay. Bottom to top, and then look to see for parentheses or brackets, is the topmost point an open circle or closed circle? Same with the bottom. And sometimes you might have 2 values on that graph where it exists at one of them. We're still going to use a bracket. So I hope this makes sense for you. I hope you're kind of understanding domain and range and how to use them, and specifically how to write them with the correct notation from a graph.